The courtroom felt cold that morning, like the hollow space where hope goes to die. Jackson Turner sat behind the defense table, shoulders rigid, knuckles white around his briefcase. His eyes darted when the doors to the courtroom swung open, and in walked Claire Turner, glowing, steady, her silhouette unmistakable. He froze. Not because of the way she moved, but because of what the world now saw. Claire's stomach, round and undeniable. Claire, whom he had long declared barren, when the years went by with nothing, who endured whispered insults at family dinners, who was blamed when doctors said the problem was her. Claire, walking in heavily pregnant. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward. Friends shifted in their seats. His own counsel paused mid-sentence. Claire's face held something more than pain. She held a calm power that Jackson had never imagined she would reclaim. Every accusing word he had ever spoken seemed to echo back at him in the hush. The judge looked up. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation, the stale air heavy with shame. You could almost taste the weight of all those broken promises and cruel judgments. Jackson's voice caught in his throat. The sonorous ring of his confidence shattered. The woman he tried to diminish now carried proof of life, proof that dignity can't be stolen. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Would you have stood your ground or walked away in that moment? When Jackson Turner and Claire first married, theirs was the kind of union that drew admiration. He was the charming young man with an easy smile, the kind who filled a room with his presence, confident in his ambitions and his future. She was gentle, loyal, and hopeful, always standing by his side, encouraging his every endeavor, believing his dreams were their dreams. In those early days, Claire poured her heart into the marriage, tending to their modest home, offering him a sanctuary from the pressures of the outside world. Jackson would brag to friends about her kindness, her patience, her ability to support him without question. But beneath his charm, there was a need for control, a hunger for image and appearances that quietly began to shape the dynamics of their life together. What seemed like love in the beginning gradually revealed itself as possession, and Claire's gentle devotion would soon be tested in ways she could not have imagined. The years moved forward, and with them came a mounting expectation. When the couple remained without children, the whispers began. At first, they were quiet, brushed off by Jackson as nothing more than idle talk from neighbors. But slowly he began to echo those same doubts at home. Family gatherings became unbearable. At one dinner, as Claire passed the bread basket, Jackson leaned in and muttered a remark loud enough for the table to hear. "Bread seems to be the only thing she can carry." Laughter followed, but not from Claire. She held her composure, swallowing back the sting, while Jackson basked in the attention, as if cruelty was a badge of wit. His mother, a woman of stern views, joined in, calling Claire a curse on their bloodline. With every cutting word, the walls around her heart thickened. She stopped defending herself, stopped pleading, retreating instead into silence, her only shield against their relentless scorn. For Claire, the humiliation was not confined to family tables. It spilled into the streets of their small town, where neighbors whispered behind her back, certain she was the reason the Turners had no children. In church pews and at the grocery store, she felt the sting of pitying glances, the weight of unspoken judgments. Jackson used these whispers as ammunition. He would come home from work, loosen his tie, and remind her she was less of a woman, punctuating the phrase with a dismissive wave of his hand. He controlled the finances, questioned her worth, and paraded his authority in subtle ways that left Claire shrinking into herself. Yet despite it all, she remained outwardly composed, her dignity intact. For older generations who know the cost of sacrifice, her endurance spoke volumes. Claire's silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. The kind that waits, that endures, and that knows time has a way of revealing truth. By the time the third year of their marriage passed, Jackson Turner's insults were no longer occasional jabs slipped under his breath. They became rituals. In public, at social gatherings, he carried himself with a smug authority, mocking Claire as though belittling her were part of his performance. At neighborhood barbecues, while men spoke proudly of their children, Jackson would tilt his drink and declare with a hollow laugh, "Claire couldn't grow a flower in spring, let alone a child." Guests chuckled awkwardly, some out of loyalty, others out of discomfort, but Claire sat in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate, her dignity wrapped tightly around her like armor. The word Barren became his favorite weapon, whispered in her ear at parties, slipped into conversations like poison. Even when she tried to contribute, to speak of books or art, or her volunteer work, he cut her off with a scoff, ensuring she was reduced to nothing more than the woman who failed to provide an heir. The cruelty did not end with words. Jackson tightened his grip on finances, a quiet but devastating escalation of his control. He refused her access to household accounts, chastised her for every dollar spent, and reminded her daily that she had no value of her own. When Claire suggested evening classes to sharpen her skills, to perhaps build a future for herself, he laughed, saying, "Why would anyone hire a woman who can't even do the one thing women were made for?" To outsiders, Jackson was still the polished man with a charming smile, but behind closed doors, he starved her of independence, forcing her to live under his provision while reminding her that she was, in his eyes, a burden. The weight of this humiliation pressed down on her spirit, and yet Claire endured with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every storm, her silence masking the storm within. The breaking point came not as a sudden explosion, but as a carefully orchestrated betrayal. Jackson Turner filed for divorce, a move that stunned Claire, but also confirmed the years of disdain he had carried in his heart. Worse, he did not do it quietly. He arrived at court hearings parading a younger woman, barely out of college, her hand tucked tightly in his as if to showcase the replacement he had chosen. To Jackson, this was his final humiliation, a public display meant to erase Claire, to prove to the world he had moved on to youth, to beauty, to fertility. He demanded everything in court, the house, the car, even the modest savings they had built together. To friends and family, he painted himself as the victim of a failed marriage, while Claire was cast as the flawed wife who could not meet expectations. It was not just cruelty, it was character assassination, carried out under oath and on record. Each insult, each humiliation, each betrayal was witnessed and remembered. Judges raised eyebrows at Jackson's smug tone. Friends who once laughed at his jokes now whispered doubts behind his back. Neighbors who pitied Claire began to question his cruelty. He believed his power was absolute, that Claire's silence confirmed her defeat, but in truth, every word, every act, was being documented in the hearts and minds of those who watched. The question hung heavy, not only in the minds of those seated in the courtroom, but also for anyone who has endured cruelty in silence. How much more could Claire take? How long could one woman be pushed, mocked, and broken before the scales of justice tilted in her favor? The tension grew unbearable because beneath the calm surface of Claire's quiet endurance, something unshakable remained, a truth Jackson had yet to face, but one that would soon leave him paralyzed with shame. The courtroom was already tense that morning, with Jackson Turner sitting at the plaintiff's table, smugly confident that the day would end in his favor. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie, whispering something to the young woman at his side who giggled nervously, clearly out of place in the gravity of the setting. His lawyer shuffled papers with the steady rhythm of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Then, in a moment that would shift everything, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Heads turned, murmurs rose, and then silence washed over the room. Claire Turner entered, her steps measured, her expression calm. But what drew every eye was not her composure. It was the undeniable swell of her stomach. She was pregnant, radiant, and unshaken. The very woman Jackson had labeled Barren was carrying life, and with each step she took, the fortress of lies he had built began to crumble. Gasps rippled through the gallery, papers slipped from hands, and a low murmur built among the spectators until the judge's gavel struck once, calling for order. Jackson's lawyer stammered, his rehearsed arguments scattering in his mind like leaves in the wind. The young woman at Jackson's side shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between the man she clung to and the dignified woman now commanding the room without a single word. Jackson himself froze for a fraction of a second, the color draining from his face, but pride forced him into a nervous laugh. He leaned forward, scoffing loud enough for those near him to hear. "It can't be mine. Everyone knows she couldn't." Yet even as he tried to mock, his voice wavered, betraying the storm beneath his bravado. His laughter, once sharp and cruel, now sounded hollow, out of place, a desperate attempt to hold on to the power slipping rapidly from his hands. The judge's silence carried weight, heavy and deliberate as he looked from Claire to Jackson. The courtroom audience, once accustomed to Jackson's confident swagger, now stared at him with eyes wide, waiting to see how he would reconcile years of ridicule with the undeniable truth standing before him. Claire said nothing at first. She didn't need to. Her calm gaze swept the room, her presence louder than any words could have been. For the first time in years, she was not the subject of whispers, but the bearer of undeniable truth. Jackson's arrogance, his betrayal, his carefully crafted narrative of victimhood, all teetered on the edge of collapse. He had not realized until that moment that every cruelty, every insult had brought him to this point. He was not prepared for the silence of judgment, the quiet condemnation written across the faces staring back at him. The suspense was unbearable, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting for justice to break through. The silence in the courtroom did not last long. Once Claire Turner's presence was registered, once the evidence of her pregnancy stood undeniable before the judge, the very foundation of Jackson Turner's claims began to unravel. For years, he had weaponized the word Barren, turning it into his shield and his sword. But on that day, with Claire's dignity standing tall, his credibility shattered. Every accusation he had ever made, every cruel jest, suddenly became evidence against him. His lawyer stumbled through arguments that fell flat, each point collapsing under the weight of the truth. The judge, unimpressed by Jackson's arrogance, began to question whether this man's testimony had ever been grounded in fact. What Jackson believed would be his day of triumph became the very stage upon which his lies crumbled. He could no longer brand Claire with the word barren. Instead, he stood branded himself, by shame, by arrogance, by his own hand. The consequences did not stop within the courtroom. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns and extended families. The friends who once laughed at Jackson's jokes now whispered about him in hushed tones of ridicule. His own mother, who had once echoed his insults, withdrew into silence, unable to face the spectacle her son had created. The younger woman he paraded so proudly shrank from his side, her confidence in him evaporating as she realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in his attempt to humiliate Claire. What he thought would elevate his image only cemented his downfall. The whispers he had fueled for years turned against him. Now he was the subject of ridicule. Where once he had mocked Claire at parties, he now found doors closing, invitations rescinded, and every conversation ending in sideways glances that stripped away the illusion of the man he had pretended to be. Financial ruin followed swiftly. In court, the settlement leaned heavily in Claire's favor. The house that Jackson Turner had boasted about, the car he paraded, even the savings he thought untouchable, all slipped through his fingers. The younger woman, unwilling to tie her future to a man crumbling before her eyes, left him without hesitation. The life of ease and dominance he envisioned collapsed, leaving him to face the reality of bills unpaid, assets divided, and a reputation too stained to recover. For Claire, the outcome was not about revenge, but about justice. For years he had denied her independence, controlled every dollar, and dismissed her worth. Now the scales tipped, restoring to her not only financial security, but also the freedom to rebuild her life without the chains of his cruelty. And then came the most devastating blow of all, personal ruin. Jackson Turner had built his life on the image of strength, charm, and control. In his community, he had been the man others admired or feared, the one who commanded attention with every step. But that image, polished and carefully maintained, collapsed under the weight of truth. Where once he was greeted with nods of respect, now he walked past neighbors who averted their eyes, or worse, smirked knowingly. His arrogance, the very trait that had carried him for so long, now left him hollow, ridiculed, pitied, and utterly abandoned. He was not the powerful man he claimed to be, but a shell of one, left to sit in the wreckage of his own making. Every insult he had cast, every humiliation he had delivered had returned to him multiplied. For Jackson, the punishment was not swift, but enduring, a slow collapse of everything he held dear. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the wife rose from her seat, her presence commanding more than any words could. She walked out of that courtroom, not as the broken woman he had once mocked, not as the so-called barren wife he had paraded as a failure, but as a woman carrying both life and victory within her. Each step she took was steady, deliberate, dignified, the quiet grace of someone who had endured years of cruelty yet refused to let bitterness define her. She carried new strength now, a strength that did not need to shout. Meanwhile, the man who had once filled rooms with arrogance and cruelty sat slumped in his chair, the color drained from his face, his once carefully built image shattered beyond repair. No one in that courtroom looked at him with respect anymore. Some pitied him, others ridiculed him, but not a single soul admired him. His mistress would soon leave, his friends would grow silent, and his family's whispers would no longer praise but condemn. Everything he thought he controlled had slipped through his fingers, and he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own downfall. In that silence, a final truth lingered over the room like a shadow etched in stone. In the end, arrogance always crumbles, but dignity survives.